There was a moment when Emily Carter sat alone in her car staring into the darkness, unable to turn the key in the ignition. Around her, life continued as normal. Cars entered and exited the parking lot. People walked past carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. But inside that car, time felt frozen. Just minutes earlier, she had been sitting across from a doctor who delivered words she would never forget. Words she had spent years fearing. Words that seemed to slam shut the final door she had been desperately trying to keep open. For 15 years, Emily had prayed for one miracle. 15 years of faith. 15 years of waiting. 15 years of believing that someday God would answer. Yet as she sat there gripping the steering wheel, a question echoed through her mind with a force she could no longer ignore. What happens when the prayer you've carried for most of your adult life remains unanswered? What happens when you've trusted, believed, hoped, and waited, only to find yourself standing in the exact same place where you started? And what happens when everyone around you seems to receive the blessing you've been begging heaven for? The truth is, by the time Emily reached that parking lot, she was carrying wounds nobody could see. To strangers, she appeared successful. She had a loving husband named Michael, a comfortable home, a strong faith, friends who cared about her, a life many people would have considered blessed. Yet hidden beneath every smile was a heartbreak that followed her everywhere she went. It followed her into church every Sunday. It followed her into family gatherings. It followed her into every holiday celebration, every birthday party, every baby shower, and every conversation that began with the innocent question she had learned to dread. Do you have children? Most people never noticed the pain behind her answer. Most people never saw what happened after she walked away. But God saw it. He saw every tear she cried in private, every prayer whispered into the darkness. Every moment, she wondered if heaven had forgotten her name. And although Emily couldn't see it then, the story that seemed to be ending was actually moving toward a moment that would leave an entire community stunned. What makes Emily's story remarkable isn't simply what happened in the end. It's what happened during the waiting. Because waiting has a way of changing people. Sometimes it strengthens them. Sometimes it breaks them. Sometimes it reveals fears they didn't know existed. For 15 years, Emily lived between faith and disappointment. Every month brought a fresh wave of hope. Every month seemed to end the same way. Family members tried to encourage her. Friends offered advice. Strangers shared opinions nobody asked for. Some people genuinely cared. Others quietly judged. A few openly questioned whether God would ever answer her prayers. Over time, the comments became harder to ignore. The whispers became louder. The silence from heaven seemed longer. Yet somehow she kept believing. Somehow she kept praying. Somehow she kept showing up to church and encouraging other people, even while carrying a burden that felt heavier with each passing year. Looking back now, many people would later say they never understood how she held on for so long. The answer wasn't simple. There were days she almost gave up. There were nights she questioned everything. There were moments she felt completely alone. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would challenge everything Emily believed about her future. The same woman who sat alone in that parking lot convinced her dream was over would soon experience a series of events that nobody around her could explain. The same relatives who felt sorry for her would eventually struggle to find words. The same people who quietly assumed her story had already been written would witness something they never expected to see. Yet at this moment, Emily knew none of that. At this moment, all she knew was the crushing weight of disappointment. All she knew was that 15 years had passed, and the answer still hadn't come. As the evening sky grew darker outside her car window, she took a deep breath and finally started the engine. She believed she was driving away from the end of a dream. She had no idea that another chapter was about to begin, and the events that followed would change her life forever. If someone had walked into Emily Carter's life at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. They would have seen a woman sitting quietly in her car, gathering herself before driving home. They would have seen another ordinary evening in another ordinary town. What they would not have seen was that Emily was standing at a crossroads between heartbreak and a future she could not yet imagine. Because while she sat there convinced that her story was nearing its end, events were already moving in a direction that would leave doctors searching for answers, family members overwhelmed with emotion, and an entire church congregation celebrating a moment many believed would never come. Years later, people would still talk about what happened. Some would call it extraordinary timing. Others would call it a blessing. Many would simply call it a miracle. But at this point in the story, none of those words existed in Emily's mind. All she could see was disappointment. All she could feel was exhaustion. And all she could hear were the doctor's words replaying over and over again. What makes this story so remarkable is not simply where it ends, but how impossible that ending seemed at the time. Because within the months that followed, a physician who believed he had seen everything would find himself staring at results he never expected to see. A husband named Michael Carter, who had spent years trying to stay strong for the woman he loved, would eventually break down in tears in a way nobody had ever witnessed before. Friends who had quietly encouraged Emily for years would struggle to contain their emotions. Family members who once questioned whether her prayers would ever be answered would find themselves speechless. And inside the church where Emily had spent countless Sundays praying through tears, a moment would unfold that people would remember for years to come. Yet none of those moments make sense without understanding the long road that came before them. Because miracles are often measured by the size of the obstacle that stood in their way. And in Emily's case, that obstacle had been growing larger with every passing year. The questions surrounding Emily's story only become more difficult the deeper you look. Why did she have to wait 15 years? Why did every answer seem delayed while everyone around her moved forward with their lives? What happened inside that doctor's office that left her sitting alone in a dark parking lot questioning everything she believed about her future? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how did a woman who had reached the point of losing hope become the center of a story that nobody in her community could stop talking about? The answers are not as simple as they may appear. In fact, the truth begins long before the doctor's appointment, long before the tears, and long before the waiting became almost unbearable. It begins with two young people who believed life would unfold according to plan. Two people who never imagined they would spend the next 15 years fighting a battle that would test their faith, their marriage, and their understanding of God's timing. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you're about to hear is one that has encouraged countless people facing their own seasons of waiting, disappointment, and uncertainty. And if you've ever wondered whether God still sees you in the middle of your struggle, you'll want to stay with us until the very end. To understand how Emily reached this breaking point, we have to go back to the beginning. Back before the tears. Back before the doctor's offices. Back before the difficult conversations and sleepless nights. Back to a time when everything seemed possible. Back to when Emily Carter and Michael Carter were simply two young people in love, standing on the edge of a future they believed would unfold exactly the way they had planned. Neither of them could have imagined that the journey ahead would become one of the greatest tests of their lives. Long before Emily Carter found herself sitting alone in that parking lot, long before the doctor's appointment that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about her future, her story looked remarkably ordinary. In many ways, it was the kind of story millions of people dream of having. Emily met Michael Carter during their college years in Ohio. Friends often described them as the couple everyone expected to last. There was no dramatic beginning, no complicated love triangle, no grand gesture that looked like it belonged in a movie. Instead, their relationship was built on something much simpler and far more enduring. Friendship, trust, shared values. They enjoyed the same things. They laughed easily together. They talked about their future with the confidence that often comes with youth. Both believed that life, while never perfect, would generally unfold the way they planned. As their relationship grew stronger, so did their dreams. They talked about careers they hoped to build, places they wanted to visit, the home they hoped to buy someday. And more than anything else, they talked about family. It wasn't an occasional conversation. It was part of nearly every discussion about the future. Children were never a question. They were simply part of the picture, just as natural as the sunrise that followed every morning. When Michael proposed, Emily said yes without hesitation. Friends and family celebrated. Wedding plans quickly followed. The ceremony itself wasn't extravagant, but it was meaningful. Surrounded by loved ones, they exchanged vows and stepped into what they believed would be the next chapter of a long and happy life together. Looking back, there was something beautiful about their certainty. They truly believed they knew what the future held. A small home, a growing family, children running through the backyard, birthday parties, school plays, family vacations, holiday dinners crowded around a table filled with laughter. Eventually, grandchildren. They often joked about becoming the kind of grandparents who spoiled their grandchildren and then sent them home. Those conversations felt so natural that neither Michael nor Emily ever stopped to consider another possibility. Why would they? They were healthy. They were young. They were in love. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared possible. Like so many newlyweds, they assumed the hardest decisions ahead would involve choosing a neighborhood, decorating a home, or perhaps deciding on baby names. They couldn't imagine the battle waiting ahead. The first few years of marriage were filled with excitement and progress. Michael focused on advancing his career, while Emily pursued her own professional goals. Together they purchased their first home, a modest but beautiful place they immediately began turning into their own. Weekends were spent painting walls, rearranging furniture, and dreaming about what each room might someday become. One room in particular often sparked conversation: the extra bedroom at the end of the hallway. Emily would occasionally stand in the doorway imagining a crib against one wall and children's books neatly arranged on shelves. Michael would smile whenever he caught her doing it. To them, it wasn't a question of if the room would become a nursery. It was only a matter of when. Friends around them were beginning to start families. Pregnancy announcements became common. Baby showers filled their calendars. Each new announcement only increased their excitement about eventually experiencing the same joy themselves. Neither of them felt pressure. Neither of them felt concern. There was still plenty of time. Life was unfolding exactly as they expected. Or so it seemed. As months turned into years, Emily and Michael continued believing their turn would come soon. Family members occasionally asked when they planned to have children, but the questions felt harmless at first. They would smile and say they were leaving it in God's hands. And they meant it. Their faith was strong. Their hope was genuine. They never imagined that one day those same questions would become painful reminders of what seemed permanently out of reach. At this stage, however, life still felt full of possibility. Every month carried anticipation. Every year carried expectation. The future remained bright. Yet while Emily and Michael were busy building their lives and dreaming about the family they believed would soon arrive, something else was quietly taking shape. A challenge neither of them could see. A challenge that would test their patience, their marriage, and their faith in ways they never imagined possible. The first year passed quickly. Then the second. Then the third. The first year passed quickly. Then the second. Then the third. At first, neither Emily Carter nor Michael Carter paid much attention to the passing time. After all, many couples waited several years before having children. Some focused on careers. Others focused on building financial stability. There was nothing unusual about their situation, and neither of them felt any reason to worry. Every month brought fresh optimism. Every month carried the possibility that their lives were about to change. Emily continued imagining the day she would finally share exciting news with family and friends. Michael often caught himself thinking about little things too. Teaching a son how to ride a bicycle. Walking a daughter down the aisle someday. Family traditions they would create together. The dreams were still alive. In fact, they felt closer than ever. Friends reassured them that these things simply took time. Family members offered encouraging words whenever the topic came up. Don't worry, they would say. Your turn will come. At that stage, those words felt comforting. Emily believed them completely. She had no reason not to. What made the waiting easier during those early years was her faith. Emily's relationship with God had always been an important part of her life. Long before she became a wife, she had developed a habit of starting each day with prayer. It wasn't something she did because she wanted something in return. It was simply part of who she was. As the months passed without a pregnancy, her prayer life grew even deeper. Each morning she would sit quietly with her Bible, praying for wisdom, peace, and eventually, a child. Michael often joined her. Sometimes they prayed together before leaving for work. Other times they prayed before bed, asking God to bless the family they hoped to build. Their church community became another source of strength. Every Sunday they worshiped alongside people they considered family. They volunteered, attended events, supported others through difficult seasons, and found comfort in their faith. At that point, nobody viewed Emily's situation as unusual. Nobody saw it as a long-term struggle. Everyone assumed it was simply a matter of time, including Emily herself. But time has a way of changing how people see things. 1 year became 4. 4 became 5. Then 6. Gradually, something shifted. The same friends who had married around the same time as Emily and Michael were beginning to start families. Pregnancy announcements appeared more frequently. Social media feeds filled with ultrasound photos and newborn pictures. Weekend conversations increasingly revolved around diapers, schools, and parenting challenges. Emily celebrated every one of those moments. She attended baby showers, bought gifts, wrote heartfelt cards, smiled for photographs, and in many ways, she was genuinely happy for the people she loved. Yet each celebration carried a quiet reminder of the dream that remained just beyond her reach. Michael noticed it too. Neither spoke about it often, but both felt it. Every passing year made the silence harder to ignore. Every passing year made the waiting feel longer. Then something happened that Emily never expected. Younger relatives began having children. Cousins she remembered babysitting were now becoming parents themselves. Family members who once looked up to her were suddenly pushing strollers and sharing parenting advice. At family gatherings, conversations naturally centered around children. There were birthday parties, school achievements, soccer games, and family photographs filled with growing families. Emily found herself standing on the edge of those conversations more often than before. She still smiled. She still listened. She still celebrated everyone else's happiness. But privately, she couldn't stop wondering why her own story seemed stuck in place. The contrast became impossible to ignore. People who had started their families years after she married were now raising children who were already entering school. Meanwhile, the extra bedroom at the end of the hallway in her home remained untouched. The room that had once represented possibility was beginning to feel like a painful reminder of unanswered prayers. Despite everything, Emily remained hopeful. She continued praying, continued trusting, continued believing that God had not forgotten her. Yet there were moments when even the strongest faith felt tested. Moments when she sat alone and wondered why the answer seemed delayed. Moments when she questioned whether she was doing something wrong. Moments when she asked God questions that had no immediate answers. Still, she kept those thoughts mostly to herself. She didn't want to appear bitter. She didn't want to appear ungrateful. She simply wanted to understand. Michael remained her greatest source of support. Whenever discouragement crept in, he reminded her of all they still had. Their marriage, their faith, their life together. But even his encouragement could not completely silence the growing uncertainty. Because as the years continued passing, something else began to change. The reassuring comments from family and friends slowly started taking on a different tone. The gentle encouragement that once brought comfort began turning into curiosity, then concern, then something much more difficult to endure. Then the questions began. At first, they sounded harmless enough. Questions wrapped in concern. Questions disguised as friendly conversation. Questions that people often asked without realizing how deeply they could hurt. Family members would lean across holiday dinner tables and ask when Emily Carter and Michael Carter planned on having children. Friends would casually bring it up during gatherings. Church members would smile and say they were praying for them, then immediately ask if there had been any news. Most people meant well. At least, that was what Emily told herself. But after hearing the same question hundreds of times over several years, something began to change. What once felt like curiosity started feeling like pressure. What once felt like encouragement started feeling like a spotlight she could never escape. Every family gathering seemed to include at least one conversation she dreaded. Every holiday dinner seemed to remind her of what was missing. Every church event seemed to place her face to face with the one prayer that remained unanswered. And while nobody could see it happening, the weight she carried was growing heavier with every passing month. The hardest part wasn't the questions themselves. It was the constant reminder that life appeared to be moving forward for everyone except her. Baby showers became especially difficult. Emily attended them faithfully. She bought thoughtful gifts. She decorated tables. She smiled for photographs. She hugged expectant mothers and celebrated alongside them. Yet every celebration carried a hidden ache. Every tiny pair of baby shoes displayed on a gift table reminded her of the nursery she had imagined years earlier. Every conversation about due dates and nursery colors reminded her of dreams that still existed only in her imagination. More than once, She found herself stepping into a restroom during an event simply to collect herself before returning with another smile. Nobody knew what happened behind those closed doors. Nobody saw the tears she quickly wiped away before rejoining the party. Most people never realized the emotional battle she fought every time she attended one of those gatherings. To them, she looked happy. To them, she looked strong. To them, she appeared fine. Holiday dinners became another challenge. Family photographs grew larger each year as new children joined the family. Conversations naturally revolved around parenting milestones, school activities, and family plans. Emily often sat quietly listening while younger relatives shared stories about raising children. Sometimes she would catch herself wondering what her own children might have looked like by now. Other times, she would calculate the years in her mind. If she had become pregnant during the early years of her marriage, her child might already be in middle school. Thoughts like those often arrived unexpectedly and lingered long after family gatherings ended. Michael noticed the effect these events were having on her. He could see it in the way she grew quieter during certain conversations. He could see it in the forced smiles and distant expressions she wore on the drive home. Yet despite his efforts to comfort her, there were wounds he could not heal. Because some forms of pain are difficult to explain, even to the people who love us most. Church, the place that had always been a source of comfort, gradually became complicated as well. Emily still loved her church family. She still found strength in worship and prayer. But even there, reminders seemed impossible to avoid. Mother's Day services became emotionally exhausting. Sermons about family sometimes left her fighting back tears. Well-meaning church members frequently approached her with advice, stories, and suggestions. Some encouraged her to keep believing. Others shared stories of women who became mothers later in life. A few offered opinions she never asked for. One person suggested she simply needed to relax. Another implied that perhaps God was trying to teach her something through the waiting. Each comment left a mark, not because people intended harm, but because they spoke about a struggle they did not fully understand. Emily rarely responded. She nodded politely. She smiled. She thanked them for their concern. Then she carried their words home and replayed them in her mind long after the conversations ended. As the years continued passing, the emotional wounds grew deeper. Shame began appearing in places where hope once lived. Emily found herself avoiding certain conversations, avoiding certain events, avoiding situations she knew would trigger questions she could no longer answer. She never stopped believing in God, but she sometimes wondered why her story seemed so different from everyone else's. Why did every celebration around her feel like a reminder of what she lacked? Why did every year seem to bring answers for others while her own prayers remained suspended somewhere between earth and heaven? More importantly, how much disappointment could one person carry before something finally broke? It was a question she never spoke aloud, but one she thought about often, and unknown to everyone around her. The moment that would bring those emotions crashing to the surface was closer than she realized. Because one afternoon, while attending what should have been a joyful family celebration, Emily overheard a conversation she was never supposed to hear. The event took place on what should have been a joyful afternoon. One of Emily Carter's younger cousins was expecting her first child, and family members had gathered to celebrate. The room was filled with laughter, decorations, gifts, and the kind of excitement that naturally surrounds new beginnings. Emily arrived with a carefully chosen present, a warm smile, and every intention of enjoying the day. Like she had done so many times before, she pushed aside her own feelings and focused on celebrating someone else's happiness. To anyone watching, she appeared completely composed. She greeted relatives, helped organize gifts, participated in conversations, and congratulated the mother-to-be. But beneath the surface, she was already fighting emotions nobody else could see. Events like these had become increasingly difficult over the years. Every baby shower reminded her of the family she had spent 15 years praying for. Every celebration quietly reopened wounds she worked hard to hide. Still, she stayed. Still, she smiled. Still, she tried to be happy for those around her. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. At some point during the afternoon, Emily excused herself and stepped away from the main gathering. She needed a moment to breathe, a moment away from the noise and activity. As she walked down a hallway toward the restroom, she heard voices coming from a nearby room. At first, she paid little attention. Family gatherings were always full of conversations. But then she heard her name. Instinctively, she slowed down. The voices belonged to two relatives. Neither knew she was nearby. Neither knew she could hear every word they were saying. What started as casual conversation quickly turned into something far more painful. One woman expressed sympathy for Emily's situation. The other responded with a comment that would remain etched into Emily's memory for years. In a calm voice, she suggested that perhaps Michael Carter deserved the chance to have children with someone else. Perhaps, she said, he should consider finding another wife. The words struck Emily like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't think. She couldn't even breathe properly. She stood frozen in place, listening as the conversation continued. Neither person raised their voice. Neither sounded angry. In some ways, that made it even worse. They spoke as if discussing a practical solution to a problem, completely unaware that the woman whose life they were discussing was standing only a few feet away. Emily remained motionless until the conversation ended. Then she quietly stepped into the restroom and locked the door behind her. The moment she was alone, the composure she had worked so hard to maintain disappeared. Years of pain, disappointment, embarrassment, and frustration rushed to the surface all at once. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The question she had spent years trying to avoid suddenly demanded an answer. What if they were right? What if Michael deserved a life she could never give him? What if she was standing in the way of his happiness? Those thoughts invaded her mind with a force she had never experienced before. She tried to push them away, but they refused to leave. For the first time, the struggle she had always viewed as a challenge they faced together began feeling like a personal failure. She wasn't simply grieving the absence of a child anymore. She was questioning her value, questioning her purpose, questioning whether she was enough. When the event finally ended, Emily managed to make it home before breaking down completely. Michael immediately knew something was wrong. After 15 years together, he could read emotions she never verbalized. At first, she tried to brush it off. She claimed she was tired, but eventually the truth emerged. Through tears, she repeated every word she had overheard. Michael listened quietly. As the story unfolded, his expression changed from concern to disbelief. Then anger. Not anger toward Emily, but toward anyone who could speak so carelessly about the woman he loved. When she finished, he moved closer and held her while she cried. He reminded her of something he had said many times before. Their marriage had never been built on the promise of children. It had been built on love, commitment, faith, and the life they had created together. He made it clear that no conversation, no opinion, and no circumstance would change how he felt about her. Yet even his reassurance could not immediately erase the damage those words had caused. Some wounds reach deeper than comfort can easily reach. Over the following weeks, Emily found herself wrestling with thoughts she had never entertained before. She began questioning her worth in ways that frightened her. She questioned whether she had somehow failed as a wife. She questioned whether God was withholding something she desperately desired because of some flaw she couldn't see. She questioned her future. She questioned her prayers. Most painfully of all, she questioned whether her years of faith and waiting had been leading anywhere at all. During quiet moments, the voices from that conversation replayed in her mind. She heard them while driving, while lying awake at night, while sitting in church, while praying. They became impossible to escape. And although Michael remained by her side through every difficult moment, the emotional burden continued growing heavier. What neither of them realized was that the heartbreak from that baby shower would soon be overshadowed by something even more devastating. Because as painful as those words had been, the emotional pain wasn't the worst thing coming. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult Emily Carter had ever experienced. Although life around her continued as normal, something inside her had changed. The words she overheard at the baby shower lingered long after the conversation itself was over. They followed her into quiet moments. They followed her into church. They followed her into her prayers. No matter how hard she tried to move forward, she couldn't completely silence the questions that had taken root in her mind. For years, she had battled disappointment. For years, she had struggled with unanswered prayers. But this was different. This felt personal. This felt like a direct attack on her value as a woman, a wife, and a future mother. Every time she looked at Michael, she wondered if he secretly felt the same frustrations others assumed he did. Every time she saw another family with children, She wondered whether she would ever experience that joy herself. Even though Michael repeatedly reassured her, doubt had a way of returning when she was alone, and loneliness was becoming a familiar companion. Michael noticed the change immediately. Emily was quieter than usual. The woman who had always encouraged others now seemed emotionally exhausted. The woman who had once spoken confidently about trusting God's timing was beginning to struggle through conversations she once navigated with ease. Some evenings, she would sit silently on the porch watching the sunset disappear beyond the horizon. Other nights, she would lie awake long after midnight, staring into the darkness while questions raced through her mind. Michael tried everything he could think of to help. He planned small getaways, suggested taking breaks from family gatherings, encouraged her to spend time with friends who genuinely supported her. But there were some battles he couldn't fight for her, some wounds only God could heal. And although he remained a source of strength, he was carrying his own burden as well. He too had spent 15 years dreaming about children. He too had imagined family vacations, school events, and birthdays. He too felt the weight of unanswered prayers. The difference was that Michael had learned to hide his disappointment behind quiet determination. Emily often forgot that he was hurting too. As another year passed, their journey increasingly revolved around doctor's appointments, specialist consultations, medical testing, and treatment options. By now, they had invested years into searching for answers. Each appointment began with hope and often ended with uncertainty. Every new specialist seemed to offer another possibility, another treatment plan, another explanation, another reason to keep believing. Emily clung to those possibilities because they gave her something she desperately needed: hope. Yet hope became more difficult to sustain each time expectations gave way to disappointment. The emotional toll was enormous. The financial strain was significant, but neither of them wanted to stop trying. Walking away felt impossible. What if the answer was just around the corner? What if the next appointment changed everything? Those questions kept them moving forward even when exhaustion told them to quit. And so they continued, month after month, year after year, searching for the breakthrough that never seemed to arrive. Then came a period when the silence felt heavier than ever. Friends who had once shared the journey from the beginning were now raising teenagers. Younger relatives who married years later already had growing families. Social media became increasingly difficult to scroll through. Every week seemed to bring another pregnancy announcement, another newborn photo, another reminder that life continued moving forward for everyone else. Emily tried not to compare her story to anyone else's. She knew comparison could steal joy. She knew everyone faced different struggles. But knowing those truths didn't make the pain disappear. Sometimes she found herself asking questions she never intended to ask. Questions she felt guilty for even thinking. Why did it seem so easy for others? Why had 15 years passed without an answer? Why did God remain silent when she had prayed with such sincerity? These weren't questions of rebellion. They were questions born from heartbreak. Questions asked by someone who desperately wanted to keep believing but was growing tired of waiting. Yet even during her most difficult moments, Emily never completely abandoned her faith. There were days she struggled, days she doubted, days she cried until she had no tears left. But she continued showing up. She continued praying. She continued opening her Bible, even when the words felt difficult to absorb. Deep down, a small part of her still believed that God had not forgotten her. She simply couldn't understand why the journey had become so long. What she didn't know was that events were already moving toward a moment that would test her faith more severely than anything she had experienced before. The hurtful comments from relatives, the awkward conversations, the years of waiting, none of those would compare to what was coming next. Because soon, Emily and Michael would walk into a doctor's office expecting another routine appointment. Instead, they would hear news that would leave them questioning everything. News so devastating that it would bring Emily to the very breaking point teased at the beginning of this story. And when that moment arrived, she would be forced to confront a reality she never imagined possible. The appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. For Emily Carter and Michael Carter, it felt like one more step in a journey that had already lasted far longer than they ever imagined. By this point, doctors' offices had become a familiar part of their lives. They knew the waiting rooms. They knew the paperwork. They knew the routine questions and the cautious optimism that often accompanied every new consultation. As they drove to the appointment that morning, neither expected anything dramatically different. They had learned not to place too much hope in any single visit. Experience had taught them that hope could quickly turn into disappointment. Still, somewhere deep inside, both carried a quiet desire that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this appointment would finally provide the answer they had been searching for. Maybe this would be the day their long season of waiting began to make sense. But as they walked through the clinic doors, neither realized they were about to hear words that would alter the course of their lives. The examination itself seemed routine. Questions were asked. Records were reviewed. Test results were discussed. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Emily sat beside Michael, listening carefully while the doctor studied the information in front of him. The room felt calm, professional, predictable. Then something changed. The doctor's expression shifted. He grew quieter, more serious. He reviewed the same documents several times before finally setting them down. What followed was a conversation neither Emily nor Michael would ever forget. The doctor explained that after years of testing, consultations, and treatments, the outlook had become increasingly concerning. Certain complications had progressed beyond what anyone initially expected. The possibility of naturally conceiving a child now appeared extraordinarily remote. Additional interventions offered little assurance. In simple terms, the odds were worse than they had ever been. For a moment, silence filled the room. Emily heard every word, yet somehow struggled to process what they meant. 15 years of hope suddenly felt as though they were collapsing under the weight of a single conversation. As the doctor continued speaking, Emily felt herself drifting away from the room. His voice became distant. She caught fragments of information but struggled to absorb the details. Her mind kept returning to one thought. 15 years. 15 years of prayers. 15 years of waiting. 15 years of believing that someday things would change. Had all of it led to this moment? Had all of it been leading toward an answer she never wanted to hear? Beside her, Michael sat quietly, listening with a composure that concealed his own heartbreak. He asked questions. He requested clarification. He did what he always did during difficult situations. He focused on facts because facts felt easier to manage than emotions. But even he couldn't hide the disappointment in his eyes. When the appointment finally ended, they thanked the doctor and walked out together. Neither spoke much during the drive home. There seemed to be nothing left to say. Every reassuring phrase they had used over the years suddenly felt inadequate. That evening became one of the most difficult nights of Emily's life. After arriving home, she moved through the house almost mechanically. She answered questions with short responses. She avoided eye contact. She tried convincing herself she was fine. But eventually the weight became too much to carry. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had always refused to accept. What if motherhood was never going to happen? What if the nursery she had imagined all those years ago would remain empty forever? What if every prayer, every tear, every moment of faith had been leading toward a different future than the one she had envisioned? Those questions broke something inside her. Not her faith entirely, but her certainty. The confidence she once carried about the future was gone. In its place stood grief, confusion, and exhaustion. And as the hours passed, Emily found herself wrestling with a question that countless people in seasons of waiting have asked before. How do you continue trusting God when the answer seems to be no? Late that night, unable to sleep, Emily sat alone in the living room while the rest of the house remained silent. The darkness outside mirrored the heaviness she felt within. She thought about every prayer she had prayed, every scripture she had highlighted, every sermon about faith and perseverance, every promise she had held on to during the hardest moments. She wanted answers. She wanted understanding. More than anything, she wanted peace. But peace felt distant. For the first time, she wondered whether she had reached the end of her strength, whether she had finally run out of hope. Yet, even in that moment, something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. Though Emily could not see it, though Michael could not see it, and though nobody around them suspected it, the story was moving toward a turning point. The chapter that appeared to be ending was quietly preparing the way for another chapter to begin. But before that could happen, Emily would find herself on her knees, pouring out one of the most honest prayers she had ever spoken. A prayer that would come not from confidence, but from complete surrender. For years, Emily Carter had prayed with faith. She had prayed with expectation. She had prayed with hope. She had prayed through tears, through disappointment, through confusion, and through countless moments when the future felt uncertain. But the prayer she prayed that night was different from every prayer that came before it. There were no carefully chosen words, no specific requests, no promises, no attempts to convince God to act. By the time Emily sat alone in her living room, she had reached a level of emotional exhaustion she had never known before. 15 years of waiting had finally caught up with her. 15 years of unanswered questions. 15 years of smiling through pain. 15 years of watching other people receive the very blessing she had begged heaven for. The weight of it all settled heavily on her shoulders. For the first time, she stopped trying to be strong. She stopped trying to hold everything together. She stopped trying to figure out what she needed to do differently. Instead, she simply sat there in silence, surrounded by the pieces of a dream she no longer knew how to carry. The room was dark except for a small lamp glowing in the corner. Michael had already gone to bed, sensing that Emily needed time alone. He wanted to help her. He wanted to say something that would make the pain disappear. But after 15 years, he had learned that some battles could not be fixed with words. Some moments simply had to be lived through. And so Emily sat quietly, staring at the floor as memories filled her mind. She remembered the day she and Michael talked about starting a family. She remembered standing in the empty bedroom at the end of the hallway, imagining it as a nursery. She remembered every doctor's appointment, every treatment, every prayer, every hopeful expectation. She remembered the baby showers, the holiday gatherings, the questions, the comments, the conversation she overheard at her cousin's baby shower, the words that suggested Michael deserved another wife. Each memory felt like another weight pressing against her heart. For years she had carried those burdens while telling herself she could handle them. That night she realized she couldn't carry them anymore. Slowly, Emily lowered herself onto her knees. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation, no emotional speech. Only a woman who had reached the end of her own strength. For several minutes, she said nothing at all. Tears slipped down her face as she struggled to find words. Then finally, she spoke. Not as someone demanding answers. Not as someone negotiating with God. Not as someone presenting conditions. She simply spoke honestly. She told God she was tired. Tired of pretending she wasn't hurting. Tired of wondering why the answer had not come. Tired of carrying expectations she could no longer manage. She admitted fears she had hidden from everyone around her. She confessed doubts she felt ashamed to acknowledge. And then, perhaps for the first time since this journey began, she stopped asking for a specific outcome. Instead, she placed everything in God's hands. The dream, the disappointment, the future, the questions, the pain, every part of it. She surrendered all of it. For many people, surrender sounds simple. But for Emily, it was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Because surrender meant releasing control over a dream she had spent 15 years protecting. It meant accepting that the future might look different from the one she had imagined. It meant trusting God, even if the answer she wanted never arrived. And that kind of trust does not come easily when your heart has been broken repeatedly. As she prayed, a battle unfolded within her. Faith confronted despair. Hope confronted exhaustion. Part of her still wanted to hold on to the dream exactly as she had always envisioned it. Another part of her knew she could not continue carrying the burden the way she had been. The struggle was intense, emotional, deeply personal. Yet somewhere in the middle of that prayer, something shifted. Not in her circumstances, not in her situation. Nothing around her changed. The doctor's diagnosis remained the same. The years of waiting remained the same. The unanswered questions remained the same. But something inside Emily began to change. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace she could not fully explain. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't the confidence that everything would suddenly work out. It was something quieter, a calmness she hadn't felt in a very long time. The questions were still there. The disappointment was still there. Yet the crushing weight that had been sitting on her shoulders seemed lighter somehow. She remained on her knees for a long time, saying very little. Eventually, she stood, wiped her tears, and walked toward the bedroom. Nothing about that evening looked remarkable from the outside. There were no dramatic signs, no voices from heaven, no immediate answers. In fact, if anyone had observed her life at that moment, they probably would have assumed nothing had changed at all. And in many ways, they would have been right. The following days seemed ordinary. Emily returned to work. She attended church. She spent time with Michael. Life continued moving forward exactly as it always had. The doctor's diagnosis still hung over them. The future remained uncertain. Yet those closest to her began noticing something different. Emily seemed calmer, more at peace. Not because her problems had disappeared, but because she had finally stopped carrying them alone. Even so, she had no idea what lay ahead. She had no idea that the prayer she whispered in the quiet darkness of her living room would become one of the most important moments of her entire life. Because while Emily believed she was simply surrendering a dream, events were already beginning to unfold in ways she could not yet see. And what happened next seemed insignificant at first. In the days following that prayer, life appeared to continue exactly as it always had. Emily Carter woke up each morning, went to work, spent time with Michael Carter, attended church, and moved through her routine without expecting anything to change. After 15 years of disappointment, she had learned not to read too much into small details. Hope had taught her many lessons, but experience had taught her caution. If something felt different, she told herself it was probably nothing. If something seemed unusual, there was likely a simple explanation. That mindset protected her from disappointment. At least, that was what she believed. Yet as the days passed, subtle changes began appearing. They were easy to dismiss at first. So easy, in fact, that Emily barely gave them any attention. She felt more tired than usual. Not dramatically tired, just enough to notice. She blamed stress. The previous weeks had been emotionally exhausting. Between the doctor's appointment and everything that followed, fatigue seemed perfectly understandable. There was no reason to think otherwise. Life had been overwhelming. Anyone would be tired under those circumstances. So she ignored it and continued moving forward. A week later, Michael noticed something she didn't. One evening, after returning home from work, Emily fell asleep on the couch before dinner. It wasn't something she normally did. Michael smiled and quietly covered her with a blanket. He assumed she simply needed rest. But then it happened again and again. Small moments, small details, nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately stood out. Yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. When he gently mentioned it, Emily laughed it off. "I'm just exhausted," she told him. "The last few months have been a lot." Michael agreed. After everything they had endured, her explanation made perfect sense. Still, a question lingered quietly in the back of his mind. A question he refused to say out loud. Not because he didn't want to, because he was afraid to. 15 years of disappointment had taught him the danger of getting his hopes up too quickly. Hope could be beautiful, but it could also be painful when expectations weren't met. So he remained silent and pushed the thought aside. As another week passed, more small changes appeared. Emily found herself becoming unusually emotional during ordinary moments. A commercial on television brought tears to her eyes. A story shared during church service affected her more deeply than usual. Even she began noticing that something felt slightly off. Yet she continued searching for ordinary explanations. Stress, fatigue, emotional exhaustion. Any of those seemed more reasonable than allowing herself to consider another possibility. Meanwhile, people around her were beginning to notice as well. A close friend from church commented that Emily looked different somehow. Healthier, happier, more at peace. Emily smiled and thanked her, assuming the change was simply a result of the peace she found after surrendering everything to God. That explanation seemed logical. After all, she genuinely did feel lighter than she had in years. The burden she had carried for so long no longer felt quite as heavy. But even that couldn't fully explain the growing list of unusual changes she continued experiencing. Then came a moment that neither Emily nor Michael could easily dismiss. One Saturday morning, while preparing breakfast, Emily suddenly stopped what she was doing and sat down. Michael immediately noticed. She looked pale. Concern flashed across his face as he asked if she was feeling all right. Emily assured him she was fine, though even she wasn't entirely convinced. For a brief moment, the same thought crossed both of their minds. The thought neither had dared speak aloud. Yet almost as quickly as it appeared, they pushed it away. They had been here before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Over the years there had been moments when hope unexpectedly resurfaced. Moments when circumstances seemed encouraging only to end in disappointment. Neither wanted to repeat that cycle. Neither wanted to place their hearts on the line again without certainty. So they continued moving forward cautiously, refusing to jump to conclusions. Yet the question remained. Days later, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since the night of her surrender prayer. The timing felt strange. Not suspicious. Not miraculous. Just unusual. The changes weren't dramatic enough to prove anything. They were simply there, quietly accumulating one after another. A little more fatigue. A little more emotion. A little more sensitivity. Individually, each detail seemed insignificant. Together, they became harder to ignore. Even so, uncertainty remained. The doctor's diagnosis still echoed in her memory. The years of waiting still stood between her and the dream she had almost let go of. Logic told her not to expect anything. Experience told her to protect her heart. Yet somewhere beneath those thoughts, a tiny spark of possibility began flickering once again. For the first time in a very long time, a question neither Emily nor Michael wanted to ask was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Could it really be possible after all these years? The answer remained hidden just beyond reach. And what neither of them realized was that within a matter of days, they would find themselves back in a doctor's office, facing a moment that would change everything. The question lingered for days. Then it lingered for another week. Emily Carter did everything she could to ignore it. She refused to let herself become carried away by possibilities. 15 years of disappointment had taught her to be careful. Hope could lift a person high enough to touch the clouds, but when it collapsed, the fall could be devastating. So whenever the thought appeared, she pushed it aside. Whenever Michael Carter gently suggested that perhaps she should schedule another appointment, she reminded him of everything they had already been through. The tests, the consultations, the treatments, the conversations, the diagnosis that had left them sitting in silence during the drive home. Yet eventually even Emily had to admit that something felt different. The changes were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming impossible to ignore. And so, with cautious hearts and guarded expectations, they scheduled another appointment. Neither wanted to discuss what they were hoping for. Neither wanted to risk speaking the possibility aloud. Instead, they focused on practical details. Dates, times, logistics, anything except the question that occupied both of their minds. The morning of the appointment felt strangely familiar. As they drove toward the clinic, memories from previous visits filled the silence between them. Over the years, they had made this drive countless times, usually with hope on the way there and disappointment on the way home. Emily stared out the window as familiar streets passed by. Michael kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, concentrating on the road ahead. Neither spoke much. There was simply too much at stake. By now, both had become experts at managing expectations. They had learned how to protect themselves from heartbreak. Yet beneath their caution, something else existed. A fragile hope neither dared acknowledge. When they finally arrived, the waiting room seemed exactly the same as it always had. The same chairs, the same quiet conversations, the same feeling of uncertainty hanging in the air. Emily signed paperwork while Michael sat beside her. Minutes felt like hours. Every passing second seemed to stretch endlessly. Eventually, a nurse called Emily's name. Together, they stood and followed her down the hallway. The examination began routinely. Questions were asked. Information was reviewed. Measurements were taken. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Emily answered calmly, while Michael remained quietly attentive. Then something changed. The doctor became unusually focused. He reviewed information once. Then again. His expression shifted in a way neither Emily nor Michael missed. Suddenly the room felt different. The casual atmosphere disappeared. In its place came silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that immediately makes people wonder whether something is wrong. Emily's heart began pounding. Michael leaned forward slightly. The doctor continued reviewing the results in front of him. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The silence seemed endless. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had something gone wrong? Had another complication appeared? Was there something they hadn't anticipated? Every difficult scenario flashed through her thoughts. The longer the doctor remained quiet, the harder it became to stay calm. Finally, the doctor looked up. His expression was unlike anything Emily had seen before. It wasn't concern. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't disappointment. In fact, he appeared almost speechless. For a moment, he simply stared at them as though trying to find the right words. Then he carefully reviewed the information one final time before speaking. What he said next seemed impossible. Emily was pregnant. The words entered the room and seemed to hang in the air. Neither Emily nor Michael reacted immediately. They couldn't. After 15 years of waiting, 15 years of praying, 15 years of disappointment, their minds struggled to process what they had just heard. The doctor repeated himself. The results were clear. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no uncertainty. Emily Carter was pregnant. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily simply stared at the doctor. The room around her seemed to disappear. Her hands began trembling. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Across from her, Michael looked completely stunned. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but couldn't find the words. The reality of the moment felt too large to comprehend. Just weeks earlier, they had been told that the possibility seemed almost impossible. Just weeks earlier, Emily had been sitting alone in her car believing a door had closed forever. And now, somehow, everything had changed. The doctor himself appeared astonished. Throughout his career, he had seen many unexpected outcomes, but even he admitted that this result was extraordinary given everything they had experienced. Yet there it was, right in front of them, confirmed, real, undeniable. The emotional release that followed was overwhelming. Emily began crying openly, unable to hold back years of accumulated pain, disappointment, hope, and longing. Every prayer she had whispered, every tear she had shed, every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, every hurtful comment, every moment of waiting seemed to come rushing back all at once. Michael reached for her hand as tears filled his own eyes. For years, he had tried to remain strong. For years, he had carried his disappointment quietly while supporting the woman he loved. But in that moment, the strength he had maintained for so long gave way to pure emotion. He lowered his head and wept. Not because of sadness, not because of fear, but because after 15 years, the miracle they had almost stopped believing possible was finally standing in front of them. For a long time, neither Emily nor Michael could stop crying. The room that had witnessed so many difficult conversations had suddenly become the place where everything changed. Yet even as they celebrated, another reality was beginning to unfold. The news would not remain private for long. Family members would soon hear. Friends would soon hear. Church members would soon hear. And the same people who had once questioned, doubted, whispered, and speculated were about to witness something that would leave them completely speechless. The news spread faster than either Emily Carter or Michael Carter expected. At first, they shared it carefully with only a few close family members. After 15 years of waiting, they almost felt protective of the miracle they had finally received. Part of them wanted to keep it private for a little while longer. Part of them wanted time to absorb the reality themselves before the rest of the world became involved. But some news simply cannot remain hidden, especially news like this. Within days, phone calls turned into conversations. Conversations turned into celebrations. Celebrations turned into a story that seemed to travel through the community almost overnight. Family members who had spent years watching Emily endure disappointment reacted with disbelief. Some cried openly when they heard the news. Others asked her to repeat it because they could hardly believe what they were hearing. For years, they had watched her remain faithful through heartbreak after heartbreak. Now they were witnessing the answer she had spent more than a decade praying for. It felt unreal. It felt impossible. Yet it was true. Perhaps nowhere was the reaction stronger than within the church community that had walked alongside Emily throughout her journey. These were people who had prayed with her, encouraged her, comforted her, and stood beside her during some of her darkest moments. They knew the years of waiting. They knew the tears. They knew the doctor's appointments and the disappointments. Many had seen her continue encouraging others, even while carrying her own burden. When the news reached the congregation, excitement spread quickly. People embraced her with tears in their eyes. Prayer groups that had faithfully lifted her name before God for years suddenly found themselves celebrating the answer they had long hoped to see. For many, it became more than just Emily's testimony. It became a reminder that faith could survive even the longest seasons of waiting. It became proof that difficult chapters do not always last forever. Sunday services felt different. Conversations felt different. Everywhere Emily went, people wanted to congratulate her. Some could hardly contain their joy. Others simply stood shaking their heads in amazement. Friends reacted in much the same way. Some who had known Emily for years admitted they had reached a point where they no longer expected this outcome. not because they lacked faith, but because 15 years is a long time. They had witnessed the disappointments. They had watched her struggle. They had seen the emotional toll the journey had taken. And while they never stopped caring, many quietly assumed the story would end differently. Now they found themselves celebrating something they once believed impossible. Every phone call seemed to bring another emotional conversation. Every visit seemed to include tears, laughter, and expressions of gratitude. Michael experienced the same reaction from people around him. Friends who knew how deeply he loved Emily were overwhelmed by the news. Many told him they had never stopped hoping for this moment. Others admitted they were simply stunned. The joy was contagious. Everywhere they went, people seemed eager to celebrate with them. But perhaps the most remarkable reactions came from those who had doubted. The same people who whispered during family gatherings. The same people who questioned. The same people who speculated about what Michael deserved. The same people who spoke about Emily's situation as though they understood it completely. Now they found themselves facing a reality they could not explain away. Suddenly, the assumptions they had made seemed small compared to the outcome standing before them. Some approached Emily privately to congratulate her. Others offered sincere apologies for things they had said or implied over the years. A few simply remained speechless. They had spent years believing they understood how the story would end. Now they were confronted with the fact that they had been wrong. Yet what happened next revealed something even more remarkable than the miracle itself. Because while the pregnancy transformed Emily's circumstances, it was her response to those people that truly revealed how much she had changed. Emily could have chosen bitterness. After everything she endured, few would have blamed her. She could have reminded people of their hurtful comments. She could have replayed old wounds and demanded explanations. She could have allowed years of pain to define her response. Instead, she chose something entirely different. She chose grace. The same woman who had been wounded by whispers and criticism now greeted people with kindness. The same woman who had cried herself to sleep after hearing cruel remarks now responded with forgiveness. She understood something many people never learn. Carrying bitterness would only extend the pain. Freedom required forgiveness. And so she forgave. Not because the comments hadn't hurt. Not because the wounds weren't real. But because she refused to let past pain steal the joy of the blessing she had received. As remarkable as the pregnancy was, it wasn't Emily's greatest victory. The true victory wasn't found in the doctor's confirmation. It wasn't found in the congratulations, the celebrations, or the stunned reactions of the community. The greatest victory was the transformation that had taken place inside her heart. Because after 15 years of disappointment, she had learned how to trust. After years of criticism, she had learned how to forgive. After years of unanswered questions, she had learned how to surrender. And that victory would become even more evident in the months that followed. Because the story was not over yet. The miracle was still unfolding. And the most emotional chapter was still to come. 44:00, 45:00, the real miracle. Months later, after years of waiting, praying, hoping, and wondering if her answer would ever come, Emily Carter finally held her child in her arms. It was a moment she had imagined thousands of times. A moment she had prayed for through countless sleepless nights. A moment she had nearly convinced herself would never happen. As she looked into the eyes of the healthy baby resting peacefully against her chest, tears filled her eyes once again. Not because of the years she had lost, not because of the pain she had endured, but because she finally understood something that had taken 15 years to learn. The miracle had never been only about the baby. The miracle had been about everything God had done inside her while she waited. Because long before her circumstances changed, something else had changed. Her heart. Over the years, Emily had been given countless reasons to become bitter. She had been judged, misunderstood, excluded, questioned, pitted. She had endured comments that cut deeply. She had listened to people speculate about her future. She had watched others receive the blessing she desperately wanted. She had stood in the middle of celebrations while carrying heartbreak nobody could see. And yet, somehow, she refused to allow those experiences to define her. She refused to allow disappointment to turn into bitterness. She refused to allow pain to destroy her faith. She refused to allow the opinions of others to determine her worth. Instead, she chose grace. The same relatives who once whispered about her now celebrated alongside her. The same people who doubted now rejoiced with her. The same individuals who questioned whether her prayers would ever be answered now witnessed the answer, standing right before them. And rather than reminding them of what they had said, Emily welcomed them with forgiveness. Because she understood something many people never learn. Forgiveness is not about pretending the hurt never happened. It is about refusing to allow the hurt to control the future. And that may have been the greatest victory of all. As the months passed, Emily and Michael Carter settled into the life they had dreamed about for so long. The nursery that once stood empty became filled with laughter. The home that had witnessed years of tears now echoed with joy. The prayers that once sounded like desperate cries became prayers of gratitude. Their family had been restored. Their faith had been strengthened. And their testimony became a source of encouragement for countless others facing impossible situations of their own. Years later, when people told Emily how amazed they were by her miracle, she often smiled and gently reminded them that the story was bigger than the blessing itself. Because many people focus on the miracle Emily received. But the greater miracle may have been the woman she became while waiting. The woman who continued believing when answers never came. The woman who continued praying when disappointment seemed unavoidable. The woman who continued trusting God when circumstances suggested she should give up. The woman who learned that faith is not proven when everything goes according to plan. Faith is proven when nothing goes according to plan and you choose to trust anyway. Because long before God changed her circumstances, He was shaping her character. Long before the miracle arrived, He was preparing her heart. Long before the answer appeared, He was writing a story far greater than she could see. And when all hope seemed lost, God answered in a way nobody could have imagined. If you were in Emily's position, would you have continued believing? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story encouraged you today, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who may be going through a difficult season, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of faith, hope, perseverance, and God's faithfulness. Thank you for watching. And remember, just because God seems silent does not mean He has forgotten you. Sometimes the chapter that feels like the end of the story is simply the place where the miracle begins.